Hi everyone! In this video we're going to be looking at the impacts that humans have on biodiversity and specifically the introduction of invasive species and subsequent endangerment of other species. So first off, an invasive species is an exotic species, so a species that's not native to the area that it's inhabiting. And in general, these species can quickly spread across large areas. They cause declines in native species. They cause harm to ecosystems, and they negatively impact human activities. So the rapid spread of invasive species is primarily due to the fact that they don't have any natural enemies in the region where they are introduced. Many invasive species are selected generalists. We already know what a generalist is. That means that a species can live in a wide range of habitats and consume lots of different types of food. So something that we haven't talked about yet is an R-selected species. This is a species that can grow really quickly. So they have lots of offspring and they don't spend a lot of time taking care of those offspring. So low parental care. Basically, they put all of their energy into producing offspring and then don't spend much energy actually taking care of them. So species like this are things like mice, plants like dandelions, fish, and other organisms that have a lot of offspring. Invasive species can be brought into a new area intentionally, or they can be brought in accidentally. Ice plant is one example of an invasive species that was brought to the California coast on purpose. So if you ever go out to the ocean, you will definitely see this ice plant. It was introduced in the early 1900s. The goal with its introduction was to help stabilize the soil along railroad tracks and highways. A lot of erosion was occurring at that time, and the idea was this ice plant creates these kind of big matted areas, and that will help keep the soil in place. Unfortunately, it is really good at forming a thick mat of plant tissue and roots. The negative side of that is that it keeps native plants from growing. So it basically kind of chokes these native plants out. And it has also taken habitats away from native animals and insects that relied on those native plant species that can no longer survive. Another invasive species that affects us is the American bullfrog. It was introduced and it is a really great competitor. So it outcompetes or preys on a lot of our native amphibian species. So controlling invasive species is really difficult because they are generally fast growing and really quick to reproduce. The most effective strategy with invasive species is to just prevent their introduction from the beginning. Ways that this is done is by inspecting goods that are entering a country, prohibiting wooden packaging that's made of untreated wood because that can hold insects that are not native to an area, and also inspecting boats for invasive species like zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are a type of mussel that are really fast to reproduce, and in areas that they've been introduced, like the Great Lakes, they can outcompete the native mussel species. So it's important that they don't enter into these ecosystems. Other control strategies are physical removal. So this is done pretty frequently with plants. With animals, it's a little harder because they can move. Sometimes we can introduce a natural predator of that invasive species and it won't have too many harmful impacts, or it will have less harmful impacts on the environment than having that invasive species had. So one example of a successful introduction of a natural predator is with the emerald ash borer. It's commonly referred to as just EAB. And this is a type of beetle that can bore into trees and ends up killing them. It's native to Asia and it was introduced to North America and caused the death and decline of tens of millions of ash trees. What scientists did is they determined that these Chinese wasps, which is what we see in these pictures, this is a Chinese wasp actually attacking an emerald ash borer, but they're a natural predator of the EABs. And what they do is, in general, they lay eggs into or on the EAB larva. A benefit is these little wasps don't actually sting many other organisms. Their focus is primarily these EABs. So this was a successful introduction and did result in huge population declines of these EABs in North America. So invasive species are one reason why some species have become endangered, but it's definitely not the only reason. Endangered species are species that are at risk of becoming extinct relatively soon. So an extinct species is one that no longer exists. It can't be found in the wild. Endangered species are at risk of extinction. So one of those ways that species become endangered is by extensive hunting, and this can be poaching or individuals and groups that are not abiding by hunting and fishing laws. So those laws are there for a reason, and they're really to benefit hunters, because if everyone abides by them, those organisms will continue to live in that area, and you can continue to go back year after year and there will be organisms to hunt. Again, specialists are very easy. It's very easy for them to become endangered if they start losing something that they're relying on. So if they have a very limited diet, like our koala and eucalyptus trees have a disease or something and those populations start to decline, koalas will be experiencing some pain as well. They can also be outcompeted by invasive species, so that's kind of what we were talking about, but invasive species are voracious. They can grow quickly, they can reproduce quickly, and they can often outcompete native species. And then if you're an organism that has a specific or limited habitat requirement. Species have evolved traits over time, these native species, that make them well adapted to a very particular habitat. So they're used to a specific amount of nutrients, a specific amount of sunlight, precipitation, type of food, other things like that. And then when we as humans change the environment, many species find it more difficult to survive. So humans have a very big impact on species. We do things like overhunt. We clear large areas of land for agriculture and development, which can displace species to areas that are not as suitable for their survival. If these species don't have a lot of genetic diversity, for example, can't evolve adaptations quickly enough, that's when their numbers start to decline. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, has collected data on approximately 50,000 species, and they've created what's called this red list. So of these species, nearly 1/3 are considered threatened or endangered. This number or percentage kind of varies between the type of organisms. Amphibians are the group that are the most endangered, and that's partially due to their sensitivity to pollution and also their reliance on both aquatic and terrestrial areas. But basically on this list, we kind of have a way to classify different organisms. At the very extreme left end, we have organisms that are extinct. Right next to that, we have organisms that are extinct in the wild, where we may have organisms in zoos. We're actively trying to breed them to return them to the wild, but currently there are no living organisms outside of captivity. Then we have different levels of threatened. We have critically threatened, which means they're very close to extinction. We have endangered, and we have vulnerable. Vulnerable means if they were to lose more habitat, they're going to become endangered. Near threatened means they're very likely to become threatened in the near future. And then LC, or least concern, basically means that species is abundant, it's pretty widespread, and it's not currently threatened. So I'm borrowing this slide from another AP Environmental Science teacher, but I think it's a really great way to see what percentages of these different organisms are endangered. So again, we have really high percentages of amphibians being endangered. That's because they're very vulnerable to climate change, because they rely on both water and land, and they have highly permeable skin. So that means if an aquatic area is polluted, amphibians are going to be the first organisms to feel the effects of that. Mammals, about 1/4 of them are endangered. Birds, slightly less. And then corals and conifers are both pretty susceptible to endangerment. Conifers are threatened because as temperatures increase, our biomes again are moving further north and south away from the equator. And with that, warmer temperatures means that new parasites can move to different areas, new diseases can expand further north and south, meaning these conifers are affected by diseases or pests that they haven't developed any adaptations to fight against, basically. This is really bad for us because conifers take in a lot of carbon dioxide. If we lose conifers, that's a really big loss, and that means that we're going to have even more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we do currently. So declines in genetic biodiversity occur because of human actions as well. Populations with low genetic diversity are not well suited to surviving environmental change, so it's a really big focus of environmental scientists to conserve and support organisms that do have low genetic diversity. So for example, we have again our Florida panther population. Due to hunting and habitat loss, they had a very tiny population, and luckily when pumas were reintroduced, that increased their genetic diversity, but this can't be done for every single species. Not only is this an issue for wild species, but this is also an issue for domestic species, so crops and livestock, and that's a big concern for humans when it comes to food stability. So livestock producers have frequently concentrated their efforts on breeding organisms that are most productive because they want to maximize their economic return. So if you are putting in a bunch of effort into growing corn or growing wheat or potatoes, you want that to be creating lots of material that you can then sell. So this has led to a decrease in genetic diversity. Inventions like fertilizers and irrigation have really allowed humans to control abiotic conditions. So in general, some plants weren't able to grow in different areas, but because we can pump in water and add nutrients to the soil that wasn't there before, that allows us to use more area to grow these plants or use that same area over and over again. So this means we can use specific varieties of crops like wheat and corn that are high yield varieties. So that means we're going to be getting a lot of material that can be sold from each individual plant. This is really risky in our current changing climate and makes crops and livestock more vulnerable to diseases. One example of this vulnerability is the Irish potato famine. So in the 1840s, farmers in Ireland were planting primarily one variety of potato. A fungus was introduced into Ireland. It was called potato blight. Unfortunately, the variety of potato that was planted was susceptible to this fungus. So over half the crop was killed, which led to more than 1 million people dying of starvation and another million people emigrating away from Ireland to different areas. So that's why this was called the potato famine, because potatoes were a huge source of food for the people of Ireland. So it was a huge impact to their survivability because they lost so much of that crop. We're thinking about causes of declining biodiversity, and luckily for you, there is this nice acronym that you can remember called HIPCO, HIPPCO, that stands for habitat destruction, invasive species, population growth, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. So these are the 6 main causes of declining biodiversity. First, habitat destruction. This is the greatest cause of decline for most species, and this is caused by human activities like clear cutting, pollution, and just using habitats for development. Then invasive species cause declining biodiversity because they don't have natural predators in that new habitat. That means, and generally they're growing faster, so they can outcompete our native species. Population growth, specifically human population growth, has created an increase in demand for space for those people to live, for food, so those people can survive, and other natural resources like fossil fuels and things like that. Pollution is a huge cause of declining biodiversity. We have pesticides and fertilizer runoff from agricultural areas that impact species. We have oil spills, and thermal pollution is something that we'll talk about in a later unit, but that's basically when you're adding heat or hot water to an environment, and that causes organisms that live there to be negatively impacted because organisms have a very specific range of conditions that they can survive in. Then we have climate change, which causes habitat loss because we have changing climate. We have changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise that can impact habitats. And then the last one is overexploitation. So domesticated organisms are managed for economic returns, which reduces biodiversity. Because again, farmers are going to want to use, or they're incentivized by other companies to use high yield crops that are generally less biodiverse than crops are naturally. So I want to talk about habitat destruction in a bit more detail. Habitat destruction can be in the form of habitat loss or habitat fragmentation. And fragmentation is when a large habitat is split into pieces, and this is often done by roads or neighborhoods, and that can have similar impacts to just losing the habitat in general. So when a large habitat is broken into smaller, more isolated habitat fragments, organisms can experience interactions with other harmful species. What I mean by that is in an environment, we have kind of the central group of organisms that live in the interior habitat, and then you have some organisms that are specifically living in the edge habitat. And an edge habitat is a zone where two habitats are overlapping, and we have some really unique characteristics. So an edge habitat may be the kind of meet up between a grassland and a forest, for example. When you experience habitat fragmentation, or when you see habitat fragmentation, what happens is these interior environments get much smaller, and we have more of these edge habitats because there's more kind of surface area around each of those small fragments. So one example of an organism that thrives in an edge habitat is the brown-headed cowbird. It prefers to live in the grassland, but it's interesting because it's actually a nest parasite. And what that means is these brown-headed cowbirds will find nests, and they will go into the forest, lay their eggs in these nests that are already existing, and then leave, and it becomes the responsibility of another species of bird to hatch their chicks. So when these habitats are fragmented, edge habitats increase, which leads to more opportunities for the brown-headed cowbird to find nests. This will negatively impact many other species of songbirds. So songbirds may only like to live within this interior habitat, and when they have less habitat in general, and then they have more cowbirds that can live in this edge habitat, and those cowbirds will come in, lay their eggs in their nests. What these cowbird chicks do is, you can see on the bottom we have a cowbird chick and a songbird. These chicks are large, and what they'll do is hatch and then push the other chicks out of the nest until the songbird is just stuck taking care of this cowbird chick. So this is really another negative piece to habitat destruction. And then, as we talked about before, when it comes to habitat destruction, specialists are more prone to population decline. That's because they're relying on a specific habitat and a specific food source. So when we talk about habitat destruction, deforestation is an example that comes to mind usually, but habitat destruction occurs throughout many different biomes. So coral reefs are experiencing habitat destruction because humans are swimming on them, doing aquatic sports on them, boating near them, which causes some corals to die, as well as in general, human activities have caused ocean warming. And then we also have grasslands, wetlands, and deserts that are being used as areas for more human development. So with these losses in biodiversity, conservation has come to the forefront of most people's minds, and there are some different strategies that are taken in order to conserve the species and ecosystems that we have. So this is not a comprehensive list, but this is the major conservation strategies. The first one is a single species approach. This is when a population of a species has dropped to extremely low numbers. The remaining individuals might be captured and brought into captivity to be bred and returned to the wild. Also, when you're focused on a single species, you may try to provide additional habitat for that species, or impart a law that is specific to that species that said it cannot be hunted anymore, or reduce contaminants that impair that species' survival. We're going to talk about legislation in more detail in class, but legislation has been created, many laws and acts that either protect single species or just types of organisms in general. So one that we'll talk about later is the Marine Mammal Act. That's not specific to one species, that's specific to an entire group of marine mammals. So then we have an ecosystem approach, which is not focused on a single species, it's focused on preserving an entire ecosystem. And in general, we focus on biodiversity hotspots. So biodiversity hotspots are regions that contain lots of species diversity and a significant number of threatened or endangered species. Obviously, if we could, we would like to conserve every single area, but the idea with these conserving biodiversity hotspots is when we can sequester an area as a preservation or a national park. You're picking an area that has the most biodiversity to kind of hit and cover as many species and protect as many species as possible. One issue with the ecosystem approach or preserving a large area is that often these come in the form of national parks. And even though this huge area is conserved, there is still human access to these areas, which will still allow for some degradation. Now, with our ecosystem approach, there are arguments for conserving a single large area or conserving several small areas. So the argument is, if you can conserve a single large area, that would support larger populations of organisms or populations of different species. But if you have several smaller areas and the same species is living in several smaller areas, that's going to promote more genetic diversity. So there are arguments for both ways, and it would be great if we could just conserve all of it. But currently, we either switch off and you preserve a large area or several small areas with different populations of the same species. Then the last conservation strategy to think about is habitat restoration, and that's what we see in the picture on the bottom right. When an area has been disturbed for some reason, be that human development, clear cutting, a natural disaster, humans can go in and help to restore that habitat by reintroducing native species that were already there. And this kind of helps speed up the process of these areas coming back to their original state. Habitat restoration is one way to help kind of speed up the process. So here's your practice FRQ for 2B. You are identifying a specific example of an invasive species and proposing a solution to limit that spread. And then describe one economic disadvantage and one economic advantage of preserving a piece of land as a wildlife preserve.